In the summer of 2017, a preservation team working inside the crumbling foundation of an abandoned Spanish colonial mission in the high desert of New Mexico broke through a section of adobe floor that had been sealed, as best as anyone could tell, for a very long time. What they found underneath was not the simple earthen subfloor they expected. It was a passage, narrow enough that you'd have to turn sideways to enter it, leading down about 12 feet into a dry, dark chamber carved partly from the natural bedrock and partly by human hands. The mission above it had been built in the 1680s. The chamber below it had been there considerably longer. Considerably longer. The first investigator to descend that passage carried a flashlight and a notebook. She came back up with 20 pages of notes and an expression her colleagues later described as somewhere between awe and confusion. Over the following 14 months, a small, careful, largely unpublicized excavation recovered 20 distinct traces of occupation from that chamber. Some of them objects, some of them structural features, some of them things that don't fit neatly into either category. 3 of the 20 have been quietly flagged in internal reports as, and I'm quoting directly here, inconsistent with all currently accepted models of pre-contact southwestern prehistory. If you're wondering why you haven't heard about this before, you're asking exactly the right question. Subscribe now and stay with me through all 20, because number 1 is the reason this chamber was sealed in the first place, and it will change what you think you know about who was here and what they understood. Number 20 sets the stage, and it does so with something that looks, at first, almost boring. Pressed into the clay floor of the chamber, perfectly preserved by the extreme aridity of the high desert environment, were the prints of bare human feet. Not a single set of prints. 17 distinct sets, moving in multiple directions, overlapping in the places near the center of the chamber and separating toward the walls. The forensic analyst brought in to study them determined that the prints belonged to between 9 and 12 individual people, ranging in apparent foot size from what would correspond to a small adult female to a large adult male. The depth and distribution of the prints indicated prolonged, repeated use of this chamber over an extended period, not a single visit or event. What made these prints worth cataloging as Object 20 rather than simply as background evidence was one specific detail. In the center of the chamber, where the print density was highest, several of the prints showed a specific stance, feet roughly shoulder-width apart, weight shifted to the balls of the feet, the heel barely touching the ground. Every physical anthropologist who examined the photographs identified that stance independently as consistent with someone performing sustained, careful manual work at a fixed position. Someone stood there, at the center of that chamber, for a long time, doing something with their hands. Whatever they were doing left no direct trace. What it left were 20 prints pressed half an inch into dry clay that remembered every detail. Number 19 was a wall, not a separate structure, but a section of the chamber's northern wall that had been treated differently from the rest. The natural bedrock had been smoothed with abrasive tools to a flat, even surface roughly 6 feet wide and 4 feet tall, and that surface had been coated with a thin layer of white mineral paste, similar in composition to kaolin clay. The coating had preserved everything applied to it, and what had been applied to it was an elaborate painted composition in red, black, and a faded orange-yellow pigment. The composition covered the full 6-foot span of the treated wall. On the left side was a series of concentric circles with radiating lines that specialists in rock art documentation recognized immediately as a solar calendar motif, versions of which appear across the American Southwest from the Hohokam sites in Arizona to the ancestral Puebloan sites in Colorado and Utah. On the right side was something less familiar, a dense, carefully organized grid of symbols, each about the size of a thumbnail, arranged in rows of 12. The grid contained 144 symbols total. 40 of those symbols have since been matched to known southwestern petroglyph traditions. The remaining 104 have not been matched to anything in the North American catalogs. Someone painted a known calendar next to an unknown text on a wall that was then buried under a Spanish mission for 300 years. That fact alone should keep you up at night. Number 18 was a cache of worked stones, 23 of them, arranged in a shallow depression that had been deliberately scooped from the chamber floor. The stones were a mix of two types. 11 were grinding stones, small enough to be held in one hand, worn smooth on one face from use, made from local sandstone. The other 12 were something else entirely. They were spherical, almost perfectly so, about the size of a large marble, made from a dark green stone that analysis identified as serpentinite. Serpentinite does not occur naturally in New Mexico. The nearest known deposits are in California, in the Coast Ranges, roughly 900 miles to the west. The spheres showed no signs of use wear. They hadn't been ground against anything. Their surfaces were polished, but not by work. They appeared to have been polished as the final step in their creation, which means someone made 12 near-perfect stone spheres from a material sourced nearly 1,000 miles away, brought them to this desert chamber, and arranged them in a depression in the floor alongside grinding tools. Why those two categories of object were grouped together is a question that has not been answered. Number 17 was something the team initially cataloged as a structural feature before they realized it was something more. At a specific point on the eastern wall, at roughly knee height, a series of shallow holes had been drilled into the rock in a horizontal line. There were 11 holes, each about an inch in diameter and 2 inches deep, spaced exactly 4.5 inches apart. Not approximately. Exactly. The spacing was verified with calipers by 2 separate team members on 2 separate days, and came back the same both times. Holes drilled in bedrock at perfectly regular intervals suggest a measuring system, a known unit of length being applied with precision and intention. 4.5 inches is, to within a few hundredths of an inch, 1/8 of a vera, the unit of measurement used in pre-contact Mesoamerica, and later formalized in the Spanish colonial system. Whether that correspondence is meaningful or coincidental, the precision itself is not coincidental. Someone drilled those holes to exact specification, and the specification they used aligns with a unit of measurement that had no business being in a subterranean chamber in New Mexico. Number 16 was a column of charcoal marks on the southern wall, vertical, spaced irregularly, and at first assumed to be simple tally marks or possibly the remnant of a fire. A paleobotanist on the team noticed the variation in spacing and took a closer look. The marks were made with charcoal, yes, but applied with careful control. Each one a distinct dash rather than a scratch, and the spacing between them was not random. When she mapped the intervals, plotting the distance between each successive mark as a number, she found a pattern. The gaps, read in sequence, encoded a ratio that the mathematician she consulted identified as a close approximation of phi, the golden ratio, expressed as a series of successive approximations getting progressively more precise as the column descended the wall. It is the same sequence you generate if you divide successive Fibonacci numbers into each other and record each result. Whoever made those marks was working toward the golden ratio from the top of the column to the bottom, like someone teaching themselves, or recording that they already knew. If you've been watching this channel for a while, you know that finding mathematical knowledge encoded in ancient structures is not as rare as schools would have you believe. But finding it scratched on a wall beneath a desert mission in a layer that predates the mission by centuries is something else. Leave a comment right now and tell me, do you think people across ancient cultures were arriving at the same mathematical truths independently? Or do you think there was contact we haven't fully mapped yet? I read every comment. Number 15 was a hearth, which is one of the most common features in any archaeological site, except that this one was unusual in 3 ways. First, it was not a simple fire pit. It was a carefully constructed ring of flat stones, each chosen for uniform thickness, arranged in a perfect circle, 22 inches in diameter. Second, the fuel residue inside it included charred wood from at least 4 different tree species, only 2 of which grow anywhere near the site. The other 2, identified by the wood anatomist from the cellular structure of the charcoal fragments, were pinyon pine, which is local, juniper, which is local, but also copal, a resin-bearing tree whose wood was a sacred ritual fuel across Mesoamerica, and something tentatively identified as a wood from the genus Prosopis, mesquite, which, while it does grow in the southwest, does not grow at the elevation of this site. Third, the ash inside the hearth had been disturbed after the fire burned out, not by water or settling, but deliberately. arranged into a radial pattern moving outward from the center, as if someone raked the ashes into a specific configuration after the fire was extinguished. Ritual fires, configured ashes, imported sacred wood. This was not a cooking fire. Number 14 was a niche cut into the western wall, about shoulder height, roughly 8 inches wide, 8 inches tall, and 6 inches deep. A small shelf, in other words, the kind of thing any human culture puts in a wall when it wants a permanent protected place to keep something specific. The niche itself was empty when found, but it wasn't plain. Its interior surfaces were covered in fine incised lines, and a residue analysis of those surfaces found traces of red ochre, copal resin, and what appeared to be pollen from flowers that bloom in late autumn in the high desert. The flower pollen told the palynologist something important. It told her roughly when, in terms of season, the niche was last actively used. Late autumn. When she shared that finding with the wider team, a specialist in ancestral Pueblo and ceremonial cycles pointed out that late autumn corresponds precisely to the period of the most significant ceremonial cycle in the Pueblo religious calendar, the period associated with the return of the Kachina spirits and the beginning of the winter ceremonial season. That calendar is still observed today. It was already ancient when the Spanish arrived. And someone was using this niche, at this specific time of year, in this sealed underground chamber, for something that mattered. Number 13 was a set of objects that stopped the team cold when they found them, because they were so ordinary. 4 ceramic vessels, small, undecorated, made from a plain brown clay, sitting in a row against the northern wall. Not placed dramatically, not wrapped or buried, just sitting there, as if someone had set them down intending to come back and never did. The vessels ranged in size from about a cup to about a quart. 3 of them were empty. The 4th contained a dark, dried residue that laboratory analysis determined was a fermented plant preparation, likely corn-based, similar in composition to what ethnobotanists describe as a predecessor to Tizwin, a traditional fermented drink used ceremonially by Apache and related southwestern peoples. That one ordinary vessel, sitting against a wall in a sealed underground chamber, connected this space to a living cultural tradition that has never been interrupted. Someone made that drink, brought it to this place, left it. And a tradition that connects to that practice is still alive. This chamber was not a ruin. It was a room that people stopped entering. If this is your first time here, subscribe before we get to number 1, because the reason this room was sealed connects everything you're about to hear into something bigger than any individual object. Number 12 was structural, and it was, in the team's own words, alarming. Carved into the bedrock of the chamber floor were 2 parallel channels, each about 3 inches wide and 2 inches deep, running the full length of the chamber from the entrance passage to the back wall, a distance of roughly 18 feet. The channels were too narrow to be drainage features and too precise to be accidental. A hydraulic engineer consulted by the team identified them as consistent with the base channels of a water management system, specifically the kind of subfloor routing used in Mesoamerican architectural traditions to manage ritual water flow during ceremonies involving liquid offerings. The engineering knowledge required to cut those channels into bedrock with the observed precision, using only stone tools, is not trivial. And the implication that this chamber was designed from the beginning to manage the controlled flow of liquid across its floor changes the nature of the space entirely. This was not improvised. This was planned, built to a specification, by people who understood what they were building and why. Number 11 was a human hair braid, about 18 inches long, tied at both ends with fine plant fiber cordage, and coiled carefully inside a small ceramic ring that had been set into the floor. The hair was well preserved by the desert environment and provided one of the most scientifically productive samples in the entire excavation. DNA analysis determined that the hair came from a single individual of Native American ancestry, with genetic markers that placed the individual's lineage within a cluster associated with populations from the northern Gulf Coast of Mexico and the lower Rio Grande Valley, roughly 800 miles to the south. This is not impossible. Trade and migration across the southwest and northern Mexico are well documented. What made this notable was the careful preservation, the deliberate coiling, the ceramic ring set into the floor, a permanent housing made for a single lock of hair from a person who came from far away. That's not trade. That's memory. Someone wanted this person, or this connection to this person, to remain in this place. Number 10 was a carved wooden object, roughly 14 inches long, that had survived thanks to the extreme dryness of the chamber. It was shaped like a stylized figure, the kind of formalized representation where anatomical accuracy is less important than symbolic content. The figure had a broad, flattened head with carved features, a narrow body, and two stubby arms held slightly away from the torso. Every member of the team who saw it immediately noted its resemblance to the Kachina dolls, Titu, still carved today by Hopi and other Pueblo peoples. But the resemblance was not exact. The proportions were different, the features more angular, and the carving style more consistent with the tradition from further south. A specialist in Mesoamerican figurative art, who examined photographs of the object, noted parallels to ceramic figurines from the Casas Grandes culture, a sophisticated pre-contact society centered in what is now the state of Chihuahua in northern Mexico, which flourished between roughly 1200 and 1450 CE, and is known to have had extensive contact with southwestern Puebloan peoples. This object sat at the intersection of two traditions. It spoke two visual languages at once. Comment below right now and tell me, do you think the boundaries we draw between cultures on our maps ever reflected the actual way people lived and moved? I want to know what you think. Number 9 was a textile fragment. Small, about 5 inches by 7 inches, and fragile enough that it had to be supported on a custom mount before it could be examined. The weave was extraordinary, not because of its complexity, though it was complex, but because of its fiber. The warp threads, the structural threads running lengthwise, were cotton. Cotton cultivation in the pre-contact Southwest is documented and unsurprising. But the weft threads, the threads woven across, were something different. The fiber analyst identified them as silk. Not wild silk, not a native fiber that resembles silk. Actual silk, from the cocoon of the Bombyx mori silkworm, an insect that is native to China and was not introduced to the Americas in the pre-contact period under any mainstream historical model. The textile fragment is currently in storage at a university laboratory. It has been analyzed by 3 independent fiber scientists. All 3 confirmed the identification. None of them have published their findings. The fragment is approximately 800 years old by radiocarbon dating. It contains silk, and it was found in a sealed chamber beneath a desert mission in New Mexico. Number 8 was a set of handprints on the ceiling. Dozens of them, made by pressing pigment-coated hands against the rock and then removing the hand to leave the negative image, a technique as old as human art itself, found on every inhabited continent. What made these particular handprints notable was their vertical span. They covered the full height of the chamber, from about 4 feet off the floor all the way to the ceiling at its highest point of roughly 9 feet. Making handprints at 9 feet requires either a very tall person or a platform. The team found evidence of the platform, 2 parallel marks in the clay floor where wooden uprights had once stood, consistent with the base of a simple scaffolding structure. Someone built scaffolding in this room to put handprints on the ceiling. They wanted to fill the entire vertical space with this record. And among those dozens of hands, when the team photographed them systematically under raking light to enhance contrast, they found 2 prints that were significantly larger than any human hand has a right to be. 23 centimeters from wrist to fingertip, 20 centimeters across at the widest point. These are not within the normal range of human variation. The team has not publicly explained them. They appear in the photographic record, measured, documented, and filed. Number 7 was a copper bell. Small, about 2 inches tall, cast rather than hammered, with a corroded iron clapper still inside it. The bell's shape was hemispherical, the classic sleigh bell form that became widespread across Mesoamerica in the late pre-contact period. Copper bells of this general type, sometimes called tinklers in the archaeological literature, have been found at Hohokam sites in Arizona and at ancestral Puebloan sites in New Mexico, so the object type is not unprecedented in the region. What made this bell unusual was the casting, X-ray fluorescence analysis of the metal composition, showed an alloy that included not just copper, but a small percentage of tin, which creates bronze. True bronze. The controlled combination of copper and tin to produce a harder, more workable alloy is a technology that was independently developed in the Old World and, in the mainstream view, was not present in pre-contact North America outside of very limited and disputed contexts. The bell in this chamber is made of bronze. It is pre-contact in date. It is in a chamber in New Mexico. The researcher who analyzed the metal composition called it a, quote, highly anomalous result requiring further investigation. That further investigation has been ongoing for 6 years and has not been published. Number 6 was a series of marks on the floor. Not prints, not carved channels, but a drawing, done with a pointed tool in the hardened clay, covering an area roughly 3 feet by 4 feet near the center of the chamber. It depicted, unmistakably, a human figure lying on its back with arms extended, surrounded by a circle, and within that circle, various markings indicating internal structure. Every member of the team recognized the composition. It is structurally identical to a schematic of the human body within a circle, a conceptual diagram linking human proportions to geometric form. Whether you call it by its Renaissance name or recognize it as an ancient idea appearing independently in multiple traditions, the concept that human proportions encode a fundamental geometric order appears in Vitruvian writing in Rome, in tantric diagrams in India, in Aztec calendar stones, and now in a scratched drawing on a clay floor in New Mexico. Someone in this chamber was thinking about the relationship between the human body and the structure of the cosmos. They drew it on the floor so they could stand inside it. Number 5 was a bundle of plant material, tightly bound with plant fiber cordage, that had partially survived in the dry conditions. The ethnobotanist on the team spent 3 weeks analyzing its contents. The bundle included dried herbs, mineral inclusions, and one item that nothing about the setting had prepared the team to find. Tucked at the center of the bundle, wrapped in the finest layer of plant fiber, was a small piece of paper. Not hide, not bark cloth, not woven fiber pressed flat. Paper made from pulped plant material. Paper manufacturing was not, under any conventional historical model, a technology present in the pre-contact North American Southwest. Paper was made in Mesoamerica, by Aztec and Maya cultures, from the bark of the amate tree. The fragment in this bundle is currently being analyzed for botanical composition to identify the source plant. If it comes back as amate, it means someone carried a piece of Mesoamerican paper into a subterranean chamber in New Mexico. If it comes back as something else, it means someone in the pre-contact Southwest was making paper from a local plant using a technology that has left no other trace in the archaeological record. Either answer is extraordinary. Number 4 was a small, flat tablet of polished stone, roughly the size of a playing card, covered on both faces with incised symbols organized in tight horizontal rows. The stone was black, identified as obsidian from a source in the Jemez Mountains of New Mexico, which places the raw material within the region. The symbols did not. Epigraphers, specialists in undeciphered writing, were brought in to examine the photographs. The symbols on this tablet share structural features with 3 separate writing systems. Several characters resemble symbols in the Zapotec writing tradition from Oaxaca, Mexico, one of the oldest writing systems in the Americas. A smaller number have been compared to symbols in the Isthmian script from Veracruz, an even older and less understood writing tradition. And one symbol, appearing 3 times on the tablet's reverse face, has been compared by 2 independent researchers to a character in the undeciphered Proto-Sinaitic script from the ancient Near East, a comparison that has been called irresponsible by some and fascinating by others. The tablet is not Babel. It has internal order. It repeats symbols in ways that suggest grammar, or at least pattern. It says something. What it says remains unknown. Number 3 was a painted disc of fired clay, 8 inches in diameter, decorated on its face with a detailed astronomical diagram. The central feature was a large circle representing the sun, surrounded by a precise count of smaller circles, 29 of them, arranged in the ring pattern of a lunar month. Beyond that ring, a second ring contained 365 dots, one for each day of the solar year, and beyond that, rendered in a finer, more careful hand than the rest, a series of markings that an astronomer consulted by the team identified as representing the synodic cycle of Venus, the 483-day period that governs Venus's appearance as morning and evening star. A cycle that was tracked with extraordinary precision by Mesoamerican astronomers and encoded in the Dresden Codex, one of the surviving Maya manuscripts. Venus cycle astronomy is not a Southwestern tradition. It is, emphatically, a Mesoamerican one. This disk was painted by someone who knew the Venus cycle, which means either they came from a tradition that tracked it, or they had learned it from someone who did. It was found 60 miles north of the Mexican border in a sealed chamber beneath a colonial mission, and it is the most precise astronomical object ever recovered from a southwestern archaeological context. Number 2 was a child's sandal, small, woven from plant fiber, with a simple tie cord still partially intact. It was found not in the center of the chamber or near the objects of obvious ceremonial significance, but tucked into a corner near the entrance passage, as if it had been set down there, just inside the door, by habit. The sandal was the right foot, only one. The weave pattern identified by the textile analyst as most consistent with a Mogollon tradition, a cultural group that inhabited the mountains of what is now southern New Mexico and Arizona between roughly 200 and 1450 CE. The sandal is small enough to fit a child of about 6 years old. There is no ceremonial significance anyone has been able to assign to a single child's sandal left in the corner of a sealed chamber. It is simply there, and in some ways it is the most human thing in the room. Someone brought a child to this place. The child took off one sandal, or lost it, and it stayed behind. Everything else in this chamber was deliberately placed. The sandal was just left. It reminds you that behind every organized, intentional, symbolically loaded assemblage of objects, there were people. People with children. People whose children wore sandals and left them in corners. And then there is number 1. This is the reason the team lead. A woman with 30 years of field experience in southwestern archaeology submitted a formal written request to the university's ethics board before she would allow the full findings to be published. It is the reason the excavation was largely unpublicized. It is the reason the chamber, once documented, was resealed. On the back wall of the chamber, the wall opposite the entrance, the most protected and most intentional position in the entire space, someone had constructed a mosaic, not painted. Mosaic, individual pieces of colored stone and mineral material pressed into a prepared plaster surface, each piece small, each piece placed deliberately, the full composition measuring roughly 5 feet wide and 4 feet tall. The mosaic depicted a figure, standing, frontal, robed, arms at the sides with palms forward in a posture of presentation or welcome that is instantly recognizable from any tradition of sacred art. The figure wore a headdress of feathers. The figure's face was detailed, with specific features rendered carefully. The face was not the face of anyone from the Americas. It was not indigenous North American. It was not Mesoamerican. The facial features, the nose, the brow structure, the proportion of the eyes, rendered in small pieces of colored stone by someone who knew exactly what they were depicting, were, in the judgment of every physical anthropologist and forensic facial reconstruction specialist consulted by the team, consistent with a person of East Asian ancestry. A mosaic portrait of a figure of apparent East Asian origin, robed, feathered, standing in a posture of sacred presentation, on the back wall of a sealed pre-contact chamber in New Mexico. The team lead sat with that mosaic for a long time before she went back outside. The mosaic is currently being analyzed. The chamber has been resealed. The findings have not been published. And somewhere in the high desert of New Mexico, beneath a crumbling mission wall, a face looks out from a wall of colored stone at an empty room and waits for someone to finally say what it means. Here is what you just heard. 20 traces left in a sealed chamber that no one was supposed to find. A room that tracked the stars and encoded mathematics and remembered people who came from thousands of miles away. A room that a child visited and that someone thought was important enough to hide under 3 centuries of mission construction. The history that gets taught in schools is not false exactly. It is incomplete. It is a story told by people who controlled what got dug up, what got published, and what got quietly resealed. The objects in this chamber did not care about those decisions. They waited. They are still waiting. Tell me in the comments which of these 20 traces you think is most important, and why. Tell me what you think the mosaic means. Tell me if you think the silk and the bronze and the paper and the Venusian astronomy can all be explained by coincidence, or whether you think we are finally getting close to a much larger story. I will read every comment, and I will see you in the next one.